Elliot-World literature, we focus on the theme of isolation in Australian literature. I begin with Kenneth Slessor's poem, South Country. After the wave-faced anonymity of river gums and scribbly gums and bush, after the rubbing and hit of brush, you come to the South Country. As if the argument of trees were done, the doubts and quarreling, the plots and pain, all ended by these clear and gliding plains like an abrupt solution. And over the flat earth of empty forms, the monstrous contingent of air floats back, coloring with rotting sunlight and the black, bruised flesh of thunderstorms, air-arched, enormous, pounding the bony ridge. Ditches and hutches with a drench of light so huge from such infinities of height, you walk on the sky's beach while even the dwindled hills are small and bare, as if rebellious, buried, pitiful. Something below pushed up a knob of skull, feeling its way to air. This is a poem by Kenneth Slessor called South Country. And in this poem, we begin to get a sense of what I'd like to talk to you about, which is the theme of isolation in Australian literature. Slessor's poem is very intriguing in many ways. There's only one character that populates it. It's you the reader, or perhaps we might understand you, the British or the European settler coming there. Many of these settlers very ambivalent about the landscape that they're encountering for the first time. The landscape seems to be harsh. And it is indeed true that after the argument of trees, it ends. After British civilization, the things in European civilization that are most known end like an abrupt argument. The individual hits isolation. The individual hits barrenness of the Australian landscape itself. Slessor, I think, well captures the feelings, the ambivalent feelings of the early settlers. Many of them, of course, in Australia, unwilling penal or economic immigrants shipped out of Britain in their unwillingness to encounter this new country. In this lecture, I'd like to talk about, then, not only what I have, Kenneth Slessor's South Country, but also look at David Maloff's poem, Off the Map, at Elizabeth Joly's short story, Mr. Parker's fiction, and returning again to our great Australian novelist and Nobel Prize winner Patrick White in his short story, Clay. South Country is an earlier poem, much earlier than Maloff's poem, Off the Map. Maloff's poem is much more contemporary in that it talks about the journey across Australia that many young men take as almost a rite of passage, almost an initiation. As the headlights dazzle the leaves, truck drivers, throbbing on pills, climb out of the sleep of farmwood prims, behind moonlit lace bronze, and Zekas dozing, lead-headed, at ease between wars, and out into a dream of apple orchards, paddocks, tumbling with mice, bridges that slog the air. Students will be interested in this poem particularly in these truck drivers who thunder across the country. They are daredevil boys. There are another group of characters in the poem itself, those farm boys, who are left behind almost in the tire marks of the trucks themselves, and imagine the land that the truckers come from, these other boys who are almost legendary heroes, as being heavily romanticized. The truck drivers in this poem indeed almost seem and take on the aspect of legendary heroes as they cross the continent, much like, in their contemporary sense, Vos does in Patrick White's novel. Indeed, this poem, similar to another poem that we'll discuss later, Les Murray's A Dream of Wearing Shorts Forever, gives us an idea of what life is like in Australia. But whereas that poem by Les Murray is going to be a far more humorous poem and gives us far more to celebrate about Australia, this poem gives us, I think, a little bit more of a bleaker vision. Now, certainly, if we contrast the Slessor poem, South Country, with the Maloff poem, we do get an idea of progression. And that is, the Maloff poem gives us actually the possibility of a legendary hero, the possibility of a legendary triumph against the landscape. Slessor's poem gives us no such option. Slessor's poem is interested more in barrenness itself. The theme of isolation in Australian literature is well described by a particularly stunning story by Elizabeth Joly called Mr. Parker's Valentine. This is a story, excuse me, about Pearson and Eleanor Page, two, as it were, immigrants to Australia who come there to recreate a sort of countrified British pastoral life. They are tired of renting houses, and they want to buy a house, but as they buy a house, they find out that there is someone living in a small, clustered, cramped shed in the back. This character is Parker. Parker is indeed suggests the original settler population, the pioneering society, who was there, of course, before Pearson and Eleanor Page. But there is a problem. Parker is old and he is ill. And indeed, we begin to understand something of the relationship of Pearson and Eleanor Page by the way that Pearson, the husband, treats Mr. Parker, this pioneer of Australian society. Eleanor, of course, is very sympathetic toward the old man. She realizes that she herself perhaps shares some of his character faults, and she responds very empathetically to her illness. Of course, the husband does not. The husband wants very quickly to rid himself away from Parker and away from Parker's past, wants to, in fact, in many ways, remove him from the property itself. And so it is that we begin to understand that what Elizabeth Joly is setting up here is rather a condemnation of Pearson himself. The more we watch Pearson respond to the settler, Parker, the more we realize how disenchanted Eleanor is with her husband, the more removed she becomes toward him. You'll no doubt want to think about, as you read this story, the idea of what Eleanor's responsibility is. She is silent towards her husband, Pearson. Does that make her in some ways part of the fate of Parker as he dies lonely and alone? Does it allow Pearson, the husband, to go without criticism in his actions, in his treatment of this settler? The story seems to me to be filtered towards a particular, again, kind of consciousness that, much as Janet frames The Day of the Sheep, a story we'll look at later, gives us an idea of the theme of isolation, a theme of barrenness. But in this case, the isolation is completely internalized as these two British immigrants began to confront the barrenness of their own lives, and we began to confront the barrenness of Pearson's life as we watch his treatment of the settler, Parker himself. But of course the theme of isolation is most fully explored in the materials we'll read in this course in Patrick White's piece, Clay. Here we have the character, Clay. We find him, of course, as a young boy. We find that he is fatherless, being raised by his mother, Mrs. Skerritt. Mrs. Skerritt is a self-absorbed woman, naming her child, indeed, after her desire to be a potter. The father has died. And we watch the young child, Clay, emerge across time and circumstances as a very lonely child. The story is even more complicated as we realize that in later life, Clay's marriage to Marge is undercut because Clay himself is a sort of poet. And as we begin to realize this, we realize that Clay has in fact created an object of his imagination, an imaginary lover called, as it were, Lover, a sexually charged character, suggesting, of course, I imagine, the suppressed aspect of Clay's character. Indeed, by the end of the piece, we realize how much of Clay's own nature, his own sexuality, his own differentness is isolated when he kills himself at the end of the piece. In looking at Patrick White's Clay, we begin to understand something about the levels in the short story itself. Of course, conventional British or Australian culture is being criticized here, but we realize a number of things about the allegorical representation of the character Clay himself. On one hand, Clay himself could easily be read as a character that embodies Australia itself, something that is misunderstood, something that is very isolated, something that does not fit in easily. Of course, more than that, the character Clay himself represents the artist in culture. We find this in a number of pieces, in a number of places in the short story. We find it, of course, when the young character Clay wants to describe the dream to his mother, when he dreams of a dead cloud. We realize that the character must tell the story to his mother, even though he realizes that his mother will react badly, which indeed she does. On top of everything else, she cries out, "I never ever thought I'd have a freak for a son." And as a reward for telling him the story, she has his head shorn or shaved closely. Clearly, Patrick White is setting out Clay as an artist that is highly and completely misunderstood within his own home, within his own culture. The piece then begins to represent an allegory as much as it does the particular mimetic or realistic short story that Patrick White is doing. It represents more broadly a story of the fate of the artist in society. So clearly, what's being criticized here, of course, is the culture of conventionality, but quite clearly as well, Patrick White is giving us a version of the artist and his isolated role in the culture. How will these new cultural forces shape the literature of Australia? While it is not clear how future writers will react to Australia's place in the Pacific Rim, it is clear that the rich tradition of Australian literature will incorporate that change into its vast landscape.